They say time waits for no one, but sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of being early, no matter how hard you try. It was 7:58 a.m. when Sarah rushed through the crowded lobby of Milton Enterprises, clutching a folder in one hand and a cup of cold coffee in the other. Her heart pounded as her heels echoed against marble floors, the sound chasing her guilt like footsteps she couldn't escape. She'd been up all night by her son's bedside, watching his fever rise and fall like waves she couldn't control. But she still came, because she always came, because she had to. The elevator doors slid open, the reflection of fluorescent lights catching her tired face. She pressed the top floor button, breathing out a shaky prayer that maybe, just maybe, no one had noticed. But the elevator climbed too slowly, each floor mocking her with another second gone. When the doors opened, silence greeted her, the kind of silence that carries judgment. Every pair of eyes lifted from their screens as she stepped out. Then, from the glass office ahead, the door opened. Richard Milton, the CEO, stepped out, adjusting the cuff of his dark suit. His watch gleamed like a verdict. 2 minutes late, he said sharply, as if the words themselves could cut. The whole floor froze. Sarah tried to speak, to explain that her son had been sick all night, that she hadn't even changed clothes, but Richard's tone didn't soften. He said the company didn't tolerate excuses, that discipline was everything, that people who couldn't respect time didn't belong here. Her fingers trembled around the folder. She tried to offer it, the report she'd finished at 3 a.m., desperate to prove her worth. But he didn't even look at it. He simply said, "You're fired." The words landed like a stone dropped in her chest. For a moment she stood still, unable to breathe. Then she nodded faintly, whispering that she understood. Her voice was steady, though her heart cracked behind it. She unclipped her ID badge and placed it on his desk with quiet dignity. The murmur of the office grew behind her like a wave she couldn't face. When she turned toward the elevator, her coffee slipped from her hand, spilling across the polished floor. No one moved to help. She just watched it spread, a dark reflection of her exhaustion. Then she stepped inside the elevator and let the doors close on the whispers. Her reflection in the mirror walls looked back at her, pale and defeated. She whispered to herself that it was okay. She'd figure something out. She always did. Outside, the morning light hit her face with cruel clarity. The city roared around her, people rushing, clocks ticking, but she felt completely still. She walked to the park bench across the street and sat down. The building loomed above her, the place she had given everything to. She reached into her bag and pulled out her wallet, opening it to the photo of her little boy, Ethan. His smile was her reason for everything. She touched the picture softly and whispered that she'd find a way. She always did. Her phone buzzed again, the babysitter saying his fever had gone down. Relief washed through her eyes, but it carried pain with it too. She looked back up at the tower, gleaming and tall, and a faint, almost sorrowful smile touched her lips. If only Richard knew who she really was. If only he had looked deeper than the time on his watch. If only he had checked the deed first. 6 months earlier, the air had smelled of antiseptic and rain. Sarah stood inside a lawyer's office, her hands trembling as she signed her name on a set of documents. Her husband Daniel's name was there too, faded but eternal. He'd built Milton Tower from the ground up. Every beam, every pane of glass bore his vision. And when he died in that sudden accident, the building became hers. But she didn't see it as ownership. She saw it as a promise. To protect what he created. To honor the people who worked within those walls. She could have stayed home, rich from inheritance, but she didn't. She wanted to see how the company treated its people, how her husband's dream had changed. So she took a job there quietly, under a different name, starting at the bottom. She learned quickly that the CEO, Richard Milton, wasn't anything like Daniel. He led through fear, not inspiration. He measured value by punctuality, not compassion. But Sarah kept her head down and her heart steady. She needed to see. She needed to understand. And now, months later, sitting on that bench, jobless, humiliated, she realized just how deep her test had gone. Her phone buzzed again, But it wasn't the babysitter this time. It was the bank statement for the building she still technically owned. The rent payments from Milton Enterprises had come in. She smiled bitterly. They were still paying her, the woman they'd just fired, without knowing it. That night, after tucking Ethan into bed, she opened her laptop and began a new spreadsheet. One column for building maintenance, another for staff welfare. She knew what she had to do. She'd use her position, her ownership, to quietly help those who needed it most, without ever stepping into the spotlight. The next morning, she returned to the same street, but instead of going inside, she sat in the coffee shop across from the tower. From that window seat, she watched. The janitors arrived before sunrise, carrying heavy equipment. The receptionists rehearsed their smiles before the doors opened. The executives breezed in late with designer bags and louder laughter. She saw everything. She overheard two employees complaining that the air conditioner on the top floor had been broken for weeks. The CEO had said repairs were too expensive this quarter. That afternoon, Sarah called a technician herself and paid for the full replacement anonymously. When the staff returned the next day, the air was cool again. They thought Richard had finally listened. He hadn't. A week later, she heard that the cleaning staff's overtime payments hadn't gone through. She quietly wired the missing funds from her private account, labeling it building adjustment. When the cleaners opened their envelopes and found the correct pay, they cried in gratitude. They never knew who was behind it. She became the silent caretaker of the place that had rejected her. Every small act of kindness repaired something more than just the building. It repaired the people inside it. Word spread quietly that someone out there cared. And though no one knew her name, they began to walk a little taller, smile a little more. 6 months passed, and during those months, Richard's control began to slip. The staff respected him less. The board questioned his decisions. Finances didn't add up, and he couldn't understand why building repairs were happening without his approval. He demanded an audit, furious at what he saw as sabotage. In his arrogance, he never thought to look at who signed the checks behind the scenes. When the board called an emergency meeting, Richard planned to reassert his authority, to show everyone who ran this company. But someone else was already on her way. That morning, Sarah stood once again before the buildings she had built with her husband's dreams. The sun rose high, glinting off the glass. She took a deep breath, straightened her coat, and walked through the doors. Heads turned as she entered. The same faces that had watched her walk out 6 months earlier. Only now her steps were steady, confident, calm. The receptionist, who had looked away that day, stood frozen. Sarah simply smiled and said she had an appointment. The woman nodded mutely and pointed toward the conference room. Inside, Richard was already speaking when Sarah entered. He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. She placed a folder on the long glass table and gently slid it forward. Richard frowned, demanding to know what this was. She didn't answer. She just told him to read. When his eyes met the first line, the color drained from his face. The room fell silent. The board members leaned in, reading the heading aloud. Milton Tower Property Deed. Owner, Sarah Collins Daniel. Whispers erupted. Richard looked up, his voice shaking for the first time anyone had heard. He said there must be a mistake. But Sarah only met his gaze with quiet grace. She said there was no mistake, only truth, long hidden. She explained how her husband had built this tower from the ground up, how he left it to her when he died, how she had chosen to work here in secret to see how the company treated its people, and how that choice had revealed more than she'd ever wanted to know. Richard couldn't speak. The board members exchanged stunned glances. She told them she wasn't there to humiliate anyone. She was there to restore something the company had lost, its heart. She said true leadership wasn't about power or punctuality. It was about compassion, about knowing that every second someone fights to survive is worth more than any minute on a clock. Then she asked them to play the footage. 6 months of building security recordings, all queued and waiting. She said everything they needed to know was already there, in those silent reels. The lights dimmed, the screen flickered to life, and in that darkness, Richard finally began to see. The screen came to life with the low hum of security footage. The first clip showed the lobby at dawn, the janitor mopping floors while the world outside still slept. Then, a figure entered quietly through the side door. A woman in a plain coat, her hair tied back, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to the janitor and smiled before disappearing into the shadows. The boardroom was silent as they watched. Richard frowned. He didn't recognize her at first, but the more clips played, the more the truth crept in. Another video appeared, dated months earlier. The staff kitchen, lights flickering. The same woman was seen replacing the light bulbs herself, climbing a small stool. She left a note on the counter that said, "Thank you for working late." The employees never knew who wrote it. Then came the footage from the top floor, technicians repairing the air conditioning. The invoices had confused Richard for months, but now, on screen, the woman was there again, signing the paperwork and quietly thanking the workers. The timestamp showed it was the same week the heat wave hit the city. The next clip was in the parking garage. The janitor, old and tired, sat by his cart counting coins in his palm, sighing at the shortage. A moment later, the woman approached and placed an envelope beside him. Inside was the missing overtime payment. She walked away before he could see her face. The clips kept playing, one after another, tiny moments of compassion strung together like pearls in the dark. A receptionist receiving flowers after her mother's surgery. A mechanic finding his rent mysteriously paid. A cafeteria worker discovering a new set of uniforms delivered overnight. Every act done quietly, without credit, without expectation. And then, finally, the day she was fired. The cameras captured the exact moment Sarah was scolded, the coffee spilling, the humiliation heavy on her shoulders. The boardroom watched it unfold from a new angle, seeing what Richard never did. Her trembling hand clutching the photo of her child, the small whisper of apology that never reached his ears, and the moment she walked out alone. Richard's eyes stayed fixed on the screen, unmoving. The air was thick with silence. The footage switched to her outside the building, sitting on that park bench across the street, the camera catching her faint smile through the window reflection. She wasn't angry. She wasn't plotting revenge. She was just breathing, trying to hold herself together. Then the reel ended. The lights came back on. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of the city outside filtered through the windows like distant thunder. Sarah stood calm, her hands folded, her face serene. The board members looked between her and Richard, uncertain whether to clap or cry. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. His voice came out smaller than before. He said he hadn't known. He said no one had told him who she really was. His words stumbled over guilt, but Sarah's eyes were kind. She said that was the point. He hadn't asked. He looked down, ashamed, realizing that in his obsession with control, he had forgotten compassion. He had built walls so high that even decency couldn't climb over them. Sarah told the board that she wanted to take back what her husband had started, that Milton Tower would no longer be a place of fear. It would become a symbol of second chances. She announced that the building was under new management, her own. The staff would keep their jobs, but the leadership would change. Effective immediately, Richard was relieved of his duties. The room went still again. Richard looked at her, eyes glassy, unable to speak. He stood slowly, trying to keep his pride intact, but it crumbled beneath the weight of humility. He asked her quietly what she would have him do now. There was no sarcasm, no arrogance left in his tone, just honesty. Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. She said every person deserved a second chance, especially those who learned from their mistakes. She offered him a position, not as CEO, not as a manager, but as janitor, the same role belonging to the man he'd once ignored. She said maybe, by cleaning the floors, he'd finally understand what it meant to build something real. The board gasped softly. Richard blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. But then, to everyone's shock, he nodded. Slowly, humbly, he nodded. He said he'd take it. The story spread through the company by sunset. The cruel CEO had been fired by the woman he'd dismissed, and yet, she showed him grace. But what stunned people most wasn't her ownership or the power reversal. It was her forgiveness. That night, as Richard walked out of the building carrying a small box of his things, the same security guard who had once turned away from Sarah handed him a set of janitorial keys. Richard accepted them without protest. He paused by the elevator where he'd fired her 6 months earlier, and for a moment, he saw his reflection, the face of a man who had everything and learned nothing. But now, he wanted to change that. Meanwhile, Sarah returned home to her small apartment, greeted by her son's laughter. Ethan ran into her arms, asking if she was happy. She smiled and said she was, truly. She told him sometimes people lose things so they can find what really matters. Over the following weeks, the building began to change. The sterile hallways filled with warmth. The break room that once held silence now echoed with laughter. Employees were encouraged to share ideas, to rest, to breathe. Small plants appeared by windowsills, and new art brightened the walls. It wasn't just business anymore. It was family. And Richard, once feared, was now seen pushing a mop through those same corridors he used to rule. Some employees mocked him at first, but Sarah stopped them with a single look. She said no one grows when others are looking down. Day by day, Richard learned. He listened to the janitor's stories, cleaned up the same messes he used to ignore, and began to see the humanity in every person he passed. He started to greet people, to thank them, to mean it. And slowly, people began to greet him back. Sarah watched from her office one afternoon as he helped the receptionist carry boxes to storage. She smiled softly. Redemption wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, and real. One evening after everyone left, Richard lingered behind. He walked into the lobby and stared up at the massive mural of the tower's construction, Daniel's legacy. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Built not by hands but by heart." He touched the inscription and whispered an apology to the man he never met, but had wronged through his actions. When Sarah came down moments later, she saw him standing there. He turned, eyes glistening, and thanked her. Not just for the chance, but for showing him what leadership really meant. She nodded, saying only that kindness doesn't cost time. It gives it back. Months passed. The company thrived again, profits higher than ever. But more importantly, people were proud to be there. Milton Tower wasn't just a building anymore. It was a home. Sarah often walked through the corridors quietly, still the same way she had during her secret days. She'd stop by the janitor's closet, the cafeteria, the mailroom, checking if everyone had what they needed. They called her the silent heart of the tower. And as for Richard, he never asked for his old title back. He found peace in his new role, in the rhythm of routine, in the gratitude of work done honestly. He said once during a company celebration that for the first time in his life, he understood the value of 2 minutes, because that was all it took to lose everything, and all it took to find himself again. Sarah smiled at that. She knew the story had come full circle. On a quiet Friday evening, as the sunset painted the windows gold, Sarah walked out of the building and looked up. The tower glowed softly against the skyline. She thought of Daniel, of his dream, and whispered that it was finally whole again. Her son's hand slipped into hers. He asked if they could go home. She said they already were. The moral of her story was simple, but it lingered long after she spoke it aloud. Never judge a clock without seeing who owns the time, because sometimes the ones you think are behind are already miles ahead, not in wealth or status, but in grace. And grace, once given, changes everything. The months rolled into seasons, and the rhythm of the tower settled into something new, something alive. Where once there had been tension and fear, there was laughter, music, and light spilling from open office doors. The people no longer rushed through their days counting seconds. They began to count blessings instead. And at the heart of it all was Sarah, walking those polished corridors not as a boss, but as a guardian of what her husband built and what she had quietly restored. Every morning began the same way. The sun hit the glass just right, scattering light across the lobby like ripples on water. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air, mixed with the faint hum of conversation. Sarah often arrived early, long before anyone else, to watch the city wake up from her office window. She didn't need to be there that early anymore, but something in her still loved those quiet hours, the calm before the day began, the peace she once longed for when chaos ruled her mornings. Downstairs, Richard would already be at work. The man who once arrived last now arrived first, He'd make sure the floors were spotless before anyone else walked in, greeting the security guards by name, checking if the plants by the windows needed watering. He didn't see it as punishment. He saw it as purpose. One morning, Sarah found him in the lobby, fixing a broken vase that had fallen from the reception counter. He was carefully gluing it together, his suit jacket folded neatly beside him. She asked why he didn't just buy a new one. He smiled faintly and said, "Because some things are worth repairing." That answer stayed with her. Later that week, she called an all-staff meeting in the conference room, something the employees hadn't seen her do before. As everyone gathered, there was an air of curiosity and anticipation. Sarah stood before them, calm but radiant, the way people look when they've found peace after a storm. She told them she wanted to share a story, not about business or profits, but about gratitude. She spoke about a woman who had once been fired for being 2 minutes late, and how that moment changed not just her life, but an entire building. She spoke softly, her voice carrying emotion that filled the room. By the time she finished, half the people were wiping tears. Then she turned to Richard, who stood quietly in the back, hands clasped. She thanked him publicly, not for what he'd done before, but for what he'd become. She said forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing growth over resentment. The staff applauded, not out of formality, but from the heart. After the meeting, Richard approached her. He told her he still didn't understand why she gave him another chance. She said she didn't do it for him. She did it for Ethan. Because one day, her son would grow up and face his own moments of injustice, and she wanted to know she had taught him the power of mercy. As weeks passed, the tower became a symbol across the city. News outlets wrote about its transformation, a company reborn through empathy. People wanted to work there, not because of prestige, but because it felt human. Sarah received letters from other single mothers thanking her for showing that dignity can't be destroyed by someone else's clock. She read them all, late at night after tucking Ethan in, her eyes glistening as she realized that her story had rippled beyond those walls. Yet, even with all the change, she stayed humble. She still ate lunch with the janitors, still asked reception how their families were, still stopped by the maintenance office to check on supplies. Her leadership didn't sit behind glass. It walked beside people. One evening, as the offices emptied and the lights dimmed, Sarah stood alone in the boardroom. The skyline shimmered outside, city lights reflecting off the windows. She walked to the corner where her husband's old photograph hung, Daniel in his construction helmet, smiling beside the half-built tower. She whispered softly that his dream was alive again. She said their son was growing strong, kind and brave, just like him. And then she smiled, because for the first time, the ache in her heart didn't feel like loss. It felt like completion. Down in the lobby, Richard swept the floors with slow, even strokes. He paused by the doors, looking out into the street where it had all begun. That cold morning when he had fired her without a thought. He could still remember the look in her eyes, not of anger, but of quiet strength. It haunted him at first, but now it guided him. He often thought about time, how he had once believed it was money, that every second lost was an opportunity wasted. But now he understood time wasn't meant to be controlled. It was meant to be shared. He used to live by the ticking of his Rolex. Now, he lived by the rhythm of gratitude. One rainy afternoon, the building lost power for several hours. The lights went out, computers died, and murmurs filled the halls. But instead of panic, laughter began to echo. Someone brought out candles, another played guitar. The staff gathered in the lobby, sharing stories by candlelight. Sarah watched from the stairwell as people connected without screens or schedules, as warmth replaced worry. Richard sat among them, passing out coffee he'd made on a small gas stove in the janitor's closet. Sarah couldn't help but smile. The tower wasn't just surviving, it was breathing again. That night, when the power returned, the staff cheered. The light flickered back on, but no one rushed to leave. They stayed, talking, laughing, savoring the glow. Sarah realized something powerful in that moment. It wasn't just electricity that had returned, it was unity. Months later, on the anniversary of Daniel's passing, Sarah held a small gathering in the lobby. She unveiled a new plaque near the entrance. It read, "Dedicated to those who build with heart, not haste." The crowd applauded quietly, tears in their eyes. Richard stood in the back, clapping the loudest. When the event ended, he approached her again, holding an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. He said it wasn't much, but he wanted her to read it later. That evening, she opened it at home. His words were simple, yet heavy with meaning. He wrote that forgiveness had given him a life he didn't deserve, and he vowed to spend the rest of it earning the second chance she'd given. He ended with one line. "You taught me that the strongest people aren't the ones who lead on time, but the ones who lead with heart." Sarah folded the letter and placed it beside her husband's photo. Then she sat by Ethan's bedside, watching him sleep, and whispered that the world was kinder than it used to be. Years went by. Ethan grew, and the tower flourished. It became a symbol of compassion in business schools, a case study on humanity and leadership. Sarah never sought the spotlight, but it found her anyway. Yet she never changed. She still took the same bench across the street some mornings, sipping coffee, watching the people rush in and out just as she once had. She smiled every time she saw someone pause to hold the door for another. That was her legacy, invisible but alive. Richard, older now, still worked in the building. He'd been promoted to facilities manager after years of humble service, though he never asked for it. He carried himself differently, slower, more deliberate. He was known for his patience, his quiet kindness. New hires didn't even know he used to be CEO. They just saw a man who cared. On one winter morning, as snowflakes began to fall, Sarah arrived early and found Richard polishing the lobby railing. She teased him about working before sunrise. He chuckled and said, "Time feels different when you finally understand it." She smiled back and said, maybe that's what her husband had wanted all along, for people to see the time between seconds. He nodded, saying softly that sometimes losing everything is the only way to learn what matters. She agreed. The day passed like any other, but as the clock neared evening, Sarah stood once more in the lobby, looking up at the golden letters that spelled Milton Tower. For the first time since it was built, those letters didn't represent one man's empire. They represented a collective heartbeat, people, stories, second chances. And as she turned to leave, her reflection caught the light from the glass doors. She saw herself not as the woman who had once been humiliated for 2 minutes, but as the woman who had transformed those 2 minutes into eternity, because time had never fired her. It had simply waited for her to rise. The years unfolded gently, like pages turning in a book that never rushed to its ending. Milton Tower stood tall through it all. Storms, recessions, the endless churn of city life. But inside its walls, something sacred remained constant. People cared for each other. They worked not out of fear, but pride. And every corner of that building whispered gratitude to the woman who rebuilt it, not with power, but with grace. Sarah's story became a quiet legend whispered by new employees who never met the cold version of the company. They said the owner once worked as an assistant. They said she swept floors, paid rents, fixed machines in the middle of the night, and never said a word about it. To some, it sounded like a myth. To those who'd been there, it was a memory carved in truth. Every December, Sarah held a simple holiday gathering in the lobby. No speeches, no luxury, just warmth. Employees brought their families. Children ran through the corridors. Laughter echoed where silence used to live. Richard would dress as Santa, his beard uneven but his heart sincere, handing out gifts bought with his own money. Every year, Sarah told him he didn't have to. Every year, he said he wanted to. One year, after the crowd had gone home, Richard lingered behind as he often did, stacking chairs and sweeping confetti. Sarah stood near the window, watching the snow fall, her reflection framed by the city lights. He joined her quietly and said the building felt alive now, as if her husband's spirit had returned. She smiled faintly and said maybe it never left. It just needed people to see it again. She turned to him and asked if he ever missed being CEO. He chuckled, shaking his head. He said titles are temporary, but peace lasts longer. He'd learned that cleaning floors taught him more about leadership than any boardroom ever did. She told him that was exactly what her husband believed. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people bound not by past mistakes, but by shared redemption. Outside, the streets shimmered with lights, and Sarah thought about how far she'd come since that morning so long ago, the day she was fired for being 2 minutes late. She still remembered the sting of it, but not with bitterness anymore. Now it felt like a beginning disguised as an ending. Life had taken something small and cruel and turned it into something beautiful. Weeks later, Sarah received an invitation to speak at a leadership summit. The organizers wanted her to tell her story, the hidden owner, the silent acts, the forgiveness. She hesitated at first. She didn't like the spotlight, but Richard convinced her, saying that maybe someone out there needed to hear it. Maybe another boss would think twice before judging a clock. So she went. The auditorium was vast, filled with entrepreneurs, executives, and students. When she walked on stage, there was no grand introduction, no dramatic music, just a quiet hum of curiosity. She began by telling them about the morning she lost everything, how humiliation can feel like the end until you realize it's just a mirror showing you who you are. She spoke about her son, about love that drives harder than ambition ever could. She spoke about the building, about the people who worked when no one saw them, and about the moment she understood that leadership isn't about control, it's about care. Her voice never rose above calm, but it carried weight. By the time she finished, the hall was silent, and then the applause came like thunder. Afterward, a young woman approached her backstage with tears in her eyes. She said she'd been thinking of quitting her job because her boss made her feel invisible. Sarah held her hands and said softly, "Don't let their clock define your worth. Time is yours to own." That moment reminded her why she'd said yes. Back at the tower, things continued to flourish. A community garden sprouted on the rooftop. Employees tended to it during lunch breaks, growing herbs and flowers they used in the cafe downstairs. The company launched a mentorship program for single parents, inspired by Sarah's journey. Lives were changing, not because of a product, but because of a principle. And then, one summer evening, Sarah received a letter that took her breath away. It came from an investor who had once pressured Richard to cut costs. The man apologized for his part in creating that toxic culture years ago. He said watching the company's transformation had changed how he ran his own businesses. He ended the letter with a single line: "You turned profit into purpose." Sarah placed the letter beside Richard's note and her husband's photograph. 3 men, 3 lessons, 1 story. But time, as it always does, kept moving. Ethan grew taller, wiser, more curious. He spent weekends helping in the office, learning from both Sarah and Richard. He once asked his mother why she forgave the man who fired her. She told him forgiveness wasn't about letting someone off the hook. It was about freeing yourself from the weight of what hurt you. She said when you forgive, you stop carrying the past, and that's when your hands are open enough to build the future. He nodded, though his young mind only half understood. Years later, he would. When Sarah turned 50, the staff surprised her with a celebration she didn't expect. The lobby was decorated with photographs spanning her journey, from her days as an assistant to her quiet repairs, from the moment she revealed the deed to the new beginnings that followed. There was one picture that made her pause. It showed her sitting on that bench across the street, holding her son's photo. Someone must have captured it through the cafe window all those years ago. She smiled through tears as she realized the story had truly come full circle. Richard raised a toast that night. His voice trembled with emotion as he said, "Once upon a time, I fired the owner of this building for being 2 minutes late. Today, she owns not just the building, but the hearts inside it." The room erupted in applause. Sarah covered her face, laughing softly through tears. When the cheers quieted, she turned to him and said, "You didn't fire me, Richard. You just gave me the story I needed to tell." As the night ended and the guests began to leave, she walked alone through the halls one last time before heading home. Every step echoed with memory, pain, patience, and grace woven together. She passed the janitor's closet, where the mop bucket still sat by the door. She smiled. knowing that the man who once ruled this tower now kept it shining with pride. Outside, the city lights flickered like old friends. Sarah paused at the bench, the same one where she had sat after losing her job, the same spot where everything changed. She closed her eyes, letting the night breeze brush against her face. She whispered a quiet thank you, to time, to fate, to forgiveness. The next morning she returned to the office early. The sunrise painted the lobby in soft gold. Richard was already there, as always, sweeping near the glass doors. He looked up and grinned, saying she was early today. She smiled back and said, "I guess I learned my lesson." He laughed, and for a moment, they both stood there, two people who had once been strangers divided by pride, now bound by humility. Later that day, Sarah gathered the team for a final announcement. She told them she would be stepping back, letting the next generation take over. The building was stable, the people strong, the mission clear. She said it was time to let others lead. When someone asked who would replace her, she pointed to her son, Ethan, standing quietly in the back. The room broke into applause. Richard smiled proudly, knowing that the legacy of kindness would continue. In her farewell words, she said that every second holds a story, that 2 minutes may feel small to one person, but infinite to another, that we never know what someone is carrying when we measure them by time. Her voice softened, filled with gratitude as she said, "Never judge a clock without seeing who owns the time." That final sentence hung in the air like music. It was more than a lesson. It was truth. The story spread far beyond the tower. News outlets replayed her words, companies quoted them, and people across the world began sharing their own stories of compassion. A simple phrase had become a movement, a reminder that kindness still mattered in a world obsessed with speed. And as for Sarah, she found peace in the simplest of things. Walking Ethan to school, watering her plants, watching the tower glow at night from her apartment window. She didn't need applause. The laughter echoing through those walls was enough. One evening, years later, long after she'd retired, she visited the building quietly. The security guard recognized her instantly and smiled wide, opening the doors. The lobby still smelled like coffee and possibility. A plaque now stood near the entrance, not the one she had placed, but a new one. It read, "In honor of Sarah Collins Daniel, for teaching us that every second counts when spent in kindness." She touched the plaque gently, tears filling her eyes. She turned to see Richard, now older and slower, walking toward her with that same warm smile. He told her the staff had insisted on the dedication. She said they shouldn't have. He said they needed to. They sat together on the bench inside the lobby, just talking. The building hummed softly around them. Computers, footsteps, laughter, all the sounds of life she had once feared she'd lose. Richard leaned back and said, "You know, Sarah, I used to think power was control, but now I know it's responsibility. You taught me that." She smiled, whispering, "And you taught me redemption." As the sun set outside, the glass walls caught the last light of the day. The reflection showed them both. A woman who turned pain into purpose, and a man who turned regret into grace. Time had circled back, gentle and whole. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the heartbeat of the building. Then she stood, straightened her coat, and looked one last time at the place where everything began. She smiled, because some stories don't end when the credits roll. They live on. In every act of kindness, every choice to pause instead of judge, every hand extended when the world looks away. And maybe that's what time was meant for all along. Not to count, but to connect. If this story changed your heart, subscribe now. Your support keeps these stories alive. Let's hit 1 million together, because kindness like this deserves to be shared.